Sure. So welcome to Evolving Relationships in 2021's Flex Work Environments. My name is Brooke Nicholson, and I serve as the Hype Develop Chair, and I will also be today's moderator. Before we get started, I do want to remind everyone that this session will be recorded, so those who registered but weren't able to attend can actually go back and watch this at a later time. Just to kind of get us all engaged here a little bit, if this is your first Hype event, virtual or in person, drop the number 1 in our chat below. We would love to see how many new attendees we have today. Oh, wow. All right, here we go. So today's topic is focused on managing relationships while organizations still find themselves in a flexible work environment. So how has communication, workflow, expectations changed over the past year? And this could be with your colleagues or managers, customers, or even external partners. So we're going to be looking at this from a variety of viewpoints. I am going to go ahead and pass this to our panelists to do some quick introductions. So Angela, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Angela Altimore. I work here at the KSU Foundation with Brooke. I've been here for about 4 years, new to the Manhattan area. I'm from Omaha originally. And my role here at the foundation is to oversee our stewardship and donor engagement team. So our team is really responsible for working with donors to engage them through events via in-person or now virtual, and help them understand that the impact that their gifts have on the university. So we work very closely with our colleagues in the foundation and then our campus partners as well.
Great, thank you. Ashley, let's go ahead and move to you, and then we'll go.
Hi, my name is Ashley Latner. I'm the development manager for Kansas Farm Bureau. I'm in our industry affairs department, so largely work on strategic planning initiatives and manage our Ending Hunger program through our foundation as well. I've got a variety of experience in terms of spent some time in academia, multiple internships with corporate America, and now find myself in the nonprofit world. So it's all very different, and the relationships are different in each of those. So I'm excited to discuss that with you today. And I might kick it to Mike. He is my boss, and so he can explain our working relationship a little bit and his role as well.
Thanks, Ashley. I prefer the word colleague. Ashley and I are colleagues at Kansas Farm Bureau. My title is Director of Industry Affairs and Development. We manage our internal foundation. A big part of the job is relationships and partnerships. As Ashley mentioned, strategic planning. We're a very unique organization. We are sort of a hybrid. We are a nonprofit family farmer rancher advocacy organization, so a full service turnkey trade group for family farmers and ranchers. But we are connected at the hip with a for-profit financial services system. They're both statewide systems. They both have completely separate agendas and budgets and governing systems. And so maneuvering between the two of those is often a challenge, and that often takes up a big chunk of our work.
And Melanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Luthei. I'm a senior project engineer for McCown Gordon Construction. So that means I work on commercial construction projects, and right now managing our relationships and work with our trade partners that put the work in place and with owners and design teams. And I currently oversee the work McCown Gordon has here in Aggieville. A little bit about my background. I started out in engineering and then kind of quickly found a love for where engineering and business kind of merged together. So technical and kind of less technical roles. And I come from working in the energy sector prior to McCown Gordon. So I was actually working a lot with remote and international clients prior to the whole world kind of taking that role. So that's been interesting to see a big shift in all companies going to a situation like that. So looking forward to speaking with all of you today.
Great, thank you. So before we jump into the panelist questions, we actually want to hear from the audience. So at this point, you can either turn on your audio, or if you would rather drop answers in the chat, we will accept that as well. What have you enjoyed most about working relationships in a hybrid work environment? Again, these can be with colleagues, your manager, customers, external partners. We're kind of going all routes today. So in the chat, or if you would like to turn on your voice today, what have you enjoyed most about work relationships in a hybrid work environment? Travel time saved.
I'll talk. I'm not as much of a typer. From the trainer side of things on the customer service level, going virtual was kind of a big change of that kind of face-to-face training to now training through a lens, or kind of now we've kind of more the learn upon, I guess, is what we use a lot of, creating more classes, kind of changing the way that we train our own employees to, do our job successfully. And then for us as a trainer team, I think it helped us kind of become more of a team and be able to, kind of delegate and make sure each person was doing their own role while it's still being virtual, but still having weekly meetings, those kind of things to touch base and have a face, with our team.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. We're seeing a lot of interactions, collaboration, kind of those relationships that have changed in the virtual environment in the chat here. So I'm actually going to flip the script here and ask you kind of the challenges. What has been the most challenging part about managing relationships in a hybrid work environment?
So I'll speak to that. A big one is not having cameras for everyone. You don't really get to see their face-to-face interaction, and you can't read those when you're talking with people. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, technology differences, people having the webcams and others not. Yeah. Tone. Yeah, Melinda. Tone in chat, email, or in like Teams chat or Skype for Business, whatever it is that your organization might use. Zoom. Yes, I know here we are today on Zoom looking through a screen, but yeah, hopefully we're all back face to face soon. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into questions here. So panelists, the first one I kind of want to know is, tell us a little bit more about how managing people changed for you during this past year. Mike, let's start with you.
Thanks, Brooke. And thank you all for joining. I failed to mention earlier background. So my background is communications professionally, journalism, which morphed into politics and government, which morphed into advocacy. So when you think about how managing people has changed as a result of 2020, clearly technology became our best friend. And fluent technologically, then they needed to get that way very quick. So that was the biggest challenge with respect to just how you can communicate. I'm a big believer in this notion of building one-on-one relationships, right? In my experience, managing people really succeeds when the two individuals can sort of read each other's minds. And that is really important when you're not face-to-face, right? When you are face-to-face, you can read body language, you can read facial expressions, and kind of get a sense of where each other are, even if the words aren't communicating that. Virtually, that really becomes a challenge. And so if I have done my job right as a manager, right, if I have sized up the individual even before they are hired, then I'm going to be that much further down that path with respect to how we can build that relationship. And again, it's really important for me, I have found, my experience has been that if you can reach that level where the expectations are shared and you understand sort of innately what they are, the accountability structure is also sort of baked into that. That takes some of the upfront logistical challenges off the plate, and you can actually do the work.
Yeah, great, great. Melanie, what about you? You're coming from kind of a different perspective there as far as kind of management goes. So tell us a little bit more about kind of how managing people changed for you.
Yeah, it was a change maybe I was a bit unprepared for. And that's because for most of a decade, I have worked with people that weren't necessarily side by side with me or in the same town. You know, I'm very used to Skype and Zoom and Teams meetings and all the things like that. But what I didn't realize was that those around me weren't ready for that and they weren't used to that. So when I felt everything shifting to going online, it was like, oh, this will be a piece of cake. This is what I'm used to. And I underestimated the challenge that was for everyone around me. So I very quickly kind of turned towards maybe a coaching idea of like, you know, how can I help those around me adjust to this flexible environment that we're now in? And so it was a bit of a challenge. And what I found is that you almost have to be a little bit more deliberate in communications because you're not face to face as often with those around you. And you can't address something on the fly like we used to be able to with the person that sat next to you or behind you. So yeah, I'd say that's been the biggest change is having finally had people around me. It was a big shift for everyone to go remotely and not have that quick, like just lean on everyone around you.
Yeah, yeah. So Angela, as you kind of look at how managing people changed for you, how did you navigate those changes in terms of kind of expectations and communication and kind of different aspects of those changes?
Yeah, so I think I tried to ask a lot of questions of the team to try to get a sense of what their needs were, not just what my needs were as the manager, but what their needs were. And I hope I did a good job of that. But I think that it's, for me, the big thing is that it's constantly evolving, right? What I needed as a manager and what my team needed early on a year ago is very different than our needs today. And so trying to keep up with that and just not be afraid to fail, to try, you know, is a daily conversation on Teams. You know, maybe that's what we need right away the first couple of weeks while we were trying to figure out this whole working remotely. But then shortly after that, it was sort of like, okay, that's too much invasion and, you know, that's too much disruption. So trying to really strike that balance to understand what's too much versus not enough. And then I think, you know, understanding that every individual is different, especially this last year. Everybody's got different baggage. Everybody's got different situations at home and at work. And it's easier for some people than it is for others. And so trying to manage that and meet those expectations as best you can and adapt, I think is important. And then I think, you know, the other thing that I would say is to go to the comment earlier about tone. And worrying about, you know, not being able to read the room and not being able to see the facial expressions if cameras aren't on and that sort of stuff. I've had to work really intentionally myself and with colleagues across the foundation that, you know, if I'm spending so much time worrying about the tone of an email, perhaps that's when I should pick up the phone and get on the phone, whether it's a Zoom call or a Teams chat or a phone, you know, old-fashioned phone call, whatever that is. I don't think we can use that enough to be able to make sure that we're really connecting in that way.
You touched on something here that I kind of was going to follow up on anyways, and that was, you know, changes being different for one person than the other. So did you feel like you ran into situations where maybe you make a change for one person and that maybe isn't the same for another?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to understand your team. You know, I have 2 direct reports, and then they each have their own direct reports. So a lot of it is working with them to understand through their lens what they're seeing from their teams, and then for me to have conversations with their team members as well to sort of make sure that we're hearing the same thing. But you know, we're starting to move back face to face now. And so a good deal of my team are back in the office now, but we also have one who's still remote. And so it's, okay, how do we engage, how do you replicate those coffee talk chats where you're just, you run into each other at the coffee machine, or, you just stop by somebody's cube, those pop-ins. Those are really hard to replicate. And there's such good stuff that comes out of there. So trying to be mindful of that, but then also helping to set the expectation to understand, listen, we can't be everything to everybody all the time. So, if we host a parking lot happy hour where people get together and, and pull up chairs, I know some of our teams did that. That doesn't mean that everybody's able to do that or comfortable doing that. And that's okay, but it's still building that camaraderie. So I think it's trying to find that happy medium of meeting them where they are, and then making sure that everybody else is still trying to get the support that they need.
Yeah. That kind of leads into kind of the discussion around creating a good work culture. So Mike, how do you create, foster, nurture a great work culture with your team living in a hybrid work environment?
That was one of our biggest challenges in 2020. When you think about our system, right, we're a family farmer rancher advocacy organization, and we have a volunteer board of directors in each of the 105 counties. So in addition to a statewide board and a number of statewide committees, membership driven, right? These are individual human beings who belong to the organization for a reason, and that reason is significant and it's legitimate. And before the pandemic, that reason would sort of manifest itself by people getting together, right? In committee meetings and board meetings and all over the state. And then all of a sudden that dynamic changes. So two things happen. One, it allowed the conversation to occur related to, my gosh, do we actually need to be meeting, right? And so that conversation led then to an outcome where people decided that, maybe meeting via Zoom or technologically is a good thing. That also, though, led to a really important conversation about this notion of how do you work together, right? And what is it that the staff has to do with respect to the members? And sort of that gets to your question, and I'll let Ashley talk about this too from her perspective. But what we do here, right, there's always a dance between whose job is it? Is it the professional staff's job to come up with thoughts and ideas and get them in front of the membership? Or is it the membership's job to develop the ideas and then we implement them, right? And that you'll get differing views depending upon your age, depending upon your gender, depending upon your culture, depending upon your experience. And so where we found 2020 to be helpful for us, and I'll speak for myself and that Ashley can join in here, was that really brought that idea up front, right? Now there's an excuse, there's a reason to have the conversation, because up until that time, it was just always sort of in the back of people's minds and never really addressed it. And so from that perspective, it allowed us to actually get that on the table, deal with it, and figure out if there's a good outcome.
Yeah. Ashley, pop in here and tell us a little bit more kind of about that interaction from an employee standpoint as well.
Yeah, I think culture, we're a huge organization, so culture is difficult for membership and for staff. And like Mike said, 2020 really gave us an opportunity to have the conversation about what does engagement look like. I apologize if I've got background noise. And so for us, I think the biggest thing was being intentional about what our goals are and being very upfront in communications about, hey, we recognize that culture is an important conversation to be having right now, and let's be intentional about implementing strategies to make sure that we maintain it and establish it throughout this time. So communications obviously looked very different. Our staff meetings changed. We implemented more like chat features in our organization. I mean, just because you don't have cubicle pop-ins, now it's almost like we're texting back and forth. And I've got more communications with other staffers that I never really talked to, simply because we've got more collaborative work going on. Everybody's been intentional about that culture. And I think that that's the most important part of trying to build and establish that throughout an organization, is simply talking about it, bringing awareness to it, and being intentional about it.
Melanie, how do you feel like empathy and connectedness plays into creating that great work culture?
Oh, that's so important. Like Angela mentioned earlier, that everyone's situation is different. So if we can have empathy about those things and understand that, what one person's going to have as a working situation could be entirely different from the next person. It's not because it's not meant to be kind of equitable for everyone. It's because that person has a specific need that needs to be met. And I think as a manager, of people and of things, like every situation, every person deserves something that's tailored to them. And that goes to personal relationships as well. No two people are going to have the same dynamic as two other people. No team's going to have the same dynamic as another team. So the empathy and the understanding of a situation, of a person, and getting that whole team, understanding is just so important right now.
Angela, I see you nodding and kind of jumping in the chat here. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm proud of, and I've got some team members on the call, so I'm trying to, I don't know if they would agree with this, but one of the things that I'm the most proud of is the transparency that we've had at all levels of the organization, in that not everybody, just because I don't have kids, right? That doesn't mean that I don't have other things going on, that are different to deal with versus my colleagues that do have kids, and all that has entailed. It's just been crazy. So I think that assuming positive intent is certainly important. And I think one of the other things that I found to be very important, that I think has been helpful, that has resonated, is the ability to talk candidly about stuff and just say, like, listen, if you got a lot going this week, or you're in a down place right now and you just need some time and some space, there's resources, and let's just talk through it. So that, there were times when I was very candid with my team and said, listen, I am not at my best at the moment, and I didn't necessarily get into the weeds about the details. That's not what it was about. But for me, it was the opportunity to help them understand, like, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to, feel the weight of the world on your shoulders right now, and just say, listen, I just need, I need you to assume positive intent with me, and just know that I'm, I will get back to my best as soon as I possibly can. And so just, I think, modeling that same behavior so that they know, listen, if they need some time and some space and resources, that's certainly something that we support, and we're, not afraid to talk about it.
Yeah. So I know in the chat when we first started, I think there was a comment about the face-to-face interaction and losing that face-to-face interaction, and we're all kind of looking through a box now. Melanie, I want to jump back to you because you come from an interesting perspective where you kind of have these internal and external partnerships that you work with. So, like I mentioned, a lot of people enjoy the ability to engage face-to-face with others. How do you sustain engagement in a hybrid work environment? Are there things that you have implemented this past year that allowed you to either maintain or improve that type of engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. Face-to-face interaction just can't be replaced, and you can only try so hard. And a few things that I have done working in construction, especially with our owner and design team reps, because those are the people that we see less face-to-face. Our trade partners that are still putting work in place on construction sites, since it was deemed an essential business, they're still out there. We still get to engage with them a little bit face-to-face. But it's the design teams and the owners of these projects that I'm working on that have been kind of especially unique, because those are the people we haven't had that opportunity with. So I made it an intent to just pick up the phone more often and check in and say, how can I help? What do you need? To be able to stay in tune with what was going on with the project, because there's so many different angles, so many different perspectives around what happens. A lot of times you just have to ask an open-ended question and say, what do you need from me? How can I help? Something like that. And you can spark a conversation that lasts for 45 minutes to an hour. I know one of the projects I was just on, I knew every time I made that phone call that I needed to have an hour set aside and a cup of coffee and a notepad in front of me, because we would have a great conversation if I would just pick up the phone and say, hey, how can I help you today? So I think that's really important to reach out to your customers, your clients, and just be present still, even if you're not there physically in front of them. I think Angela mentioned stopping by people's cubicles. The same thing goes for managing, I think, team members as well. It's just a different way to go about it. But I like to do it kind of the same way with a cup of coffee in my hand. So I had that same demeanor of kind of the relaxed, like, I'm not in a rush right now. Like, if you want to talk for an hour or hour and a half, like, I'm ready for that. So that has really helped me not, like, do the quick phone call, like, hey, can I get you off the phone yet? Like, I need to go do these 8 other things, or I have my next Zoom call. I tried to treat it like it was the same thing, just in a different location. I'm in my chair in my office instead of at the coffee room. So.
Ashley, what about you? You kind of talked about new projects kicking off and kind of that collaboration there. So, tell me a little bit more from your perspective, that engagement and kind of what that's looked like for you.
I think one of the things that I really want to speak to in this conversation is like the flexibility. Multiple people mentioned that in the chat, and flexibility, like, it has its pros and cons, right? And especially as like a young professional in a big organization, you worry about, what does not being in the office mean for me in terms of how am I perceived, and how do the expectations change, and those sorts of things. This more flexible work environment and being remote also means that I have greater control over when I'm doing my work. So I can't tell you how many Sunday afternoons I spend banging out on my laptop keyboard all the things that, I'm getting ahead for the week, or I need to catch up on, or just because of the nature of being remote and life happening during the week, whatever that looks like. I think I sent out an email at like 4 o'clock the other morning, and so this flexibility is super interesting in terms of what are our colleagues seeing on the backside of how we are appearing in our workspace now. And so that change has been really interesting. And I think that's just a question that I've been thinking about. Maybe Mike can speak to how that is perceived on the backside.
Yeah, that's, if you look closely, you'll notice Ashley's not in an office, right? Look at the background, look at where she's at. This is a really cool story. So we are a traditional, conservative, hidebound, right-leaning system, and we don't change very quickly, right? We often use the words, it's like steering a battleship. And there is an expectation and there is a culture that you show up, you sit in your cubicle 8 hours a day, and you go home, right? And the pandemic hits, and all of a sudden, people are doing that work from home. And oh my gosh, not only are they being effective, they're actually getting more work done. And so when Ashley came to me with this idea, right? She's a professional, and she's really good at what she does. She's a 21st century thinker, and she also has other skills, right? She wants to start a business. I call it a side hustle. A lot of us have different things that we do in addition to the day jobs. And so Ashley is fluent and is an expert on equine rehabilitation. And you can't start up a horse medicine place, that's not the right word, right? Sitting in a cubicle 8 hours a day. And so I took the opportunity to use it as an experiment in our system, right? So I went to my boss and said, here's what Ashley wants to do. Can we let her do that? And he was all for it for the very same reason. The way that cultures change is by actually changing the culture. And so we used Ashley as an experiment, and so far so good. But she's spot on with respect to the way people within the system will view that, right? She left Manhattan, started the business, still doing all the work, cranking it out, and we're getting more done than we did before. And it was what, Ashley, 6 or 8 weeks. Well, where's Ashley? Right? Well, she's now living in Missouri doing this work and has a side hustle, and she's succeeding in that respect. And so that was difficult for some people within the system who are used to a 20th century culture to get their heads and their hearts around. And so we were very purposeful and intentional about allowing that to occur. And I intend to be very purposeful and intentional about making sure that the system understands that there are ways to do and here's a great example.
Great, thank you, Mike. So one of the other items in the chat we saw was, people being present and accessible. One of the most important aspects of effective leadership is when leaders are perceived as present and accessible. I know we see it all the time in engagement surveys at the foundation. So Angela, in a hybrid environment, you may be, visibly present for some and not for others. I know you talked about, one member still kind of being virtual, some are back in the office. How do you manage a equitable relationship between the two?
Yeah. I think it's taking advantage of utilizing technology in new ways than we were before. So making sure that when we set up meetings, that we set them up in a way that, if we're available and you're in the office and we want to meet face to face, we can do that as long as we're still socially distanced and masked up and that, following all the protocols, but making sure that we're utilizing technology in that way to pull in those folks that are remote. Or that might just, be working, on campus that day because they've got an in between appointments or whatever that might be. I think the opportunity to let people know ahead of time, like, hey, I'm going to be offline and unavailable, for the next hour because I'm participating in this panel. So, right now my team's chat message just says, it's going to be about an hour before I can get back to anybody. So I think helping folks know that, if you've got a daycare shift where you've got daycare ends and you got to run and pick up the kiddos, then just share that. We created a very simple calendar just to let people know sort of when your office hours are that day, if it's outside the standard, 8 to 5, which we're doing, more and more of. So I think just that openness and that communication, I think is one of the things. And then I think, helping those folks that are remote that can't get back into the office yet, understand that, we'll do the best we can to engage them at the same way, but there's going to be conversations that just happen very informally outside of my office or outside of somebody else's office. And you just kind of get pulled into something and there isn't the ability necessarily to set up a room where you've got the right technology to get them on the call. And so it's sort of that trade-off to say, listen, we want to be flexible and meet you where you are, but there's going to be times when we'll have to catch you up on something, or you're going to miss out on an impromptu lunch that we might go to or happy hour or whatever that is. And that's just a trade-off. So I think, equitable, yes, but, not always fair, because that's just sort of the way that it is.
Yeah.
Build on that point, Brooke.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Mike.
Yeah, Angela is spot on. I learned when I was a young manager from a mentor about this concept of managing by exception, right? Because all human beings are not equal with respect to the way they present themselves professionally. And so, as an example, I have 2 direct reports. Ashley is one of them. I would not have pushed that intentional and purposeful experiment of allowing her to work remotely had she not been effective at her job, right? And so there are others who might not meet that level of expectation and accountability within its system, and they won't get that opportunity. And that's, I describe that as managing by exception, right? Much of it is cultural, much of it is generational, but it has proven in my experience to be a very effective management tool. And it goes to a point I made earlier, that works when you hire the right people, right? If you spend a lot of quality time up front getting to know the individual and vice versa, then that puts you in a position to be able to manage the way I just described.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Melanie, have there been changes that you prefer as far as kind of how you manage or you want to be managed since being in a hybrid environment?
I'd say I was used to the flexibility that the world has now kind of adapted to. So it's nice that everyone really caught up to that. As Mike mentioned, I think I was one of those exceptions at my last company. I had a family situation that wanted to bring me back to Kansas. and I was working for a company out of Houston, but I was in a global position. So I spent most of my time maybe at 11 o'clock at night on a Teams meeting, talking with someone in a different hemisphere, a different continent, who knew what, or it could be 6 o'clock in the morning and I was on another phone call with a different time zone. So I was used to working in a very flexible environment. You know, if I needed to do something from 2 to 3 during the day, I was used to being able to do that because I worked in the middle of the night or early in the morning, like Ashley said. And so it was not that I felt like McCown-Gordon wasn't used to that. I think McCown-Gordon's a very kind of, I guess, progressive company in terms of how they manage and the tools that they give everyone to do their jobs. But it felt like still it just wasn't the norm here in Manhattan, at least. So for me, that's been very refreshing to kind of have that flexibility back where I fully feel like that's acceptable. Because I think everyone wants to be good at their jobs. And as Mike said, if you hire the right people, those people all want to do good at their jobs. They're going to be good employees if you allow them to be. So if everyone's situation is unique, why don't we let everyone's situation be unique and let them be who they are? And they're probably more likely to be better employees because of it. So if, like Ashley's situation, if she needs to go do something else and do her side hustle, if she's a good employee, like, you should allow that. So I think that the times are changing, and everyone is kind of being able to be themselves a little bit more, which is almost refreshing. But you still have to, have accountability. But I think if, like Mike said, if you hire the right people, people just naturally want to be good at what they do. So I think it's just encouraging everyone to be able to do that and to, give them the tools and resources they need to be that person.
So Ashley, we kind of talked about your transition to, in office to remote here. Has it changed for you as far as kind of how you want to be managed now that you are full-time in a remote position?
I think Mike and I's work relationship is really cool in the fact that we did establish that relationship up front, and both of us are very much of similar mindsets in terms of communication. Like we touch base as needed, at least probably once a week, but it's pretty informal, get on the calendar, schedule it, like very flexible. And that's something that's important to me, both personally and professionally, is autonomy. And I think that we had the necessary conversations of establishing, like, hey, this is the work that needs to be done. This is the deadline. If you have any questions, let me know. That's a style that works really, really well for me because it allows it. I feel like I can be creative with that, right? Like, and I know the work that needs done. I know that it's an open door if I need help. And I know when I have to have it done by to meet the expectation. And as long as the quality is there and the deadline is met, my job is done. And so in terms of changes with respect to the environment, it really hasn't changed much because of the nature of our relationship to begin with. And that's something that I feel very lucky for, and maybe different than a lot of other people's work relationships.
Yeah. So Angela, I know we have a variety of individuals on this call. As a manager, what advice would you give other people or program managers? I'm leaving that very open and broad for you.
Sure. No, yeah, very much so. I think that remembering that everybody is different and you need to be flexible enough to adjust and adapt your style, but yet finding the balance for the team as a whole. So knowing that you're not always going to meet everybody's expectations, but trying to find that happy medium and sort of shift and adapt. As I mentioned earlier, that, being transparent, and I think starting to plan ahead, right? Starting to, when you're to the point where your offices are getting ready to reopen, if that's what's going to happen, if the remote stuff isn't going to become a permanent way of life for you, starting to plan as early as you can for that. We are having lots of conversations right now that we are not the same organization we were a year ago. we've changed as individuals, we've changed as managers, we've changed as an organization. Our clients, our donors have changed. The campus needs, that we try to meet have changed. So recognizing that there is a whole heck of a lot of work to come back to. And when you get back to day one, and when you return, it's not going to be hit the ground running, but making sure that you've, done as much ahead of time as you can. And then I think that assuming positive intent that we talked about earlier, that's important anytime, but especially as you start to re-engage and sort of bring back those relationships into whatever they look like now for you and for your organization. Like there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be missteps, own it and be okay with it. And I think for folks like me, I'm an introvert by nature. So I've learned a lot about myself this last year that I'm an introvert, but man, I crave that interaction with people. And so, to go back to that last question about how things have changed, I would much rather have somebody, hop on a call, pick up the phone, pop by my office in person instead of sending another email. Because I've missed that engagement, and I find myself trying to find ways to weave that into my work on a regular basis.
Mike or Melanie, what about, specific topics of conversations managers should be having regularly with their employees? What do you encourage managers to touch on regularly?
Yeah, I'll go. A couple things spring to mind. One is this notion of ideas that have a shelf life, right? Ideas that are perishable. And the pandemic has created a series of those great, big, lofty conversations that systems need to be having. And Angela talked about how her system is having those, right? Think about what's going on at K-State. Enrollments are declining, state dollars are shrinking. They're having a deep and meaningful conversation about what does higher education delivery look like post-pandemic? What does K through 12 education look like? What does advocacy for family farmers and ranchers look like after a pandemic? And so the shelf life, the opportunity, the perishability of those ideas, that window will come slamming home pretty quick, right? My experience tells me that as more people get vaccinated and as we return to what we all would consider normal, the default will be, let's move right back to the way we were, right? Because that's why we're comfortable. And my argument is, let's move away from that. Maybe the reality is somewhere in the middle, right? Because there are deep and meaningful conversations that will never be had absent the pandemic. And the other point that I would that made me that touches on your question is with respect to effective managing, right? With my experience has been, and Ashley can speak to this, right? There are parallel paths in terms of work that needs to be done. One is the work that you were hired to do. Here's the plan, here's the structure, here are the resources, here's the accountability, and that's logistics. We'll get there, point A to point B. The important work, especially in a system like ours, is the culture, the politics, the relationships, right? If you can master that, this stuff is just logistics, right? And so we spend a lot of time up here talking about the culture, the system, the relationships, the partnerships. Here's the way this individual thinks. This is what you might expect from this. Tomorrow, Ashley's coming to Manhattan to give a presentation to one of these volunteer boards I was talking about before. And I'm not worried about the work, right? What goes through my mind is how they will perceive the work, right? And so we spend a lot of time talking about that level that is in systems like ours just as important as the actual work.
Melanie, to kind of flip that question here, as an employee, what advice would you give other employees, so colleagues and those who maybe don't manage people? Is there anything an employee can do to help create a better working relationship with colleagues, partners, managers, etc.?
I think a great way to build those relationships with other colleagues is to offer help. I know within my company, we learn a lot from people maybe that are more at our peer level than from our managers. And that's just because those are the people that are probably doing the same things and going through the same situations, managing the same type of environment. And maybe it's our senior managers or something that aren't experiencing that same thing. So I know I've been very willing to help others, and I think, you know, my peers are as well. So I would encourage others to just offer that help and do it sincerely. You know, give that good feedback also to your peers. It's not a race against your peer. You know, everyone's in this together. If you help the person next to you succeed, the whole team is better and the company succeeds. So, you know, it's not try to be better than the person next to you. It's try to bring them with you. And people always recognize that. That's not just a management to a managee type relationship. People see that across the board when you can bring someone with you and just elevate the whole level of the company. So I would just say work hard, be flexible, and offer that sincere help to others.
Yeah. Angela, what about you?
Yeah, I would add on to that. I think Melanie is spot on. Two things come to mind. One was how moved I was a few months ago when one of my team members checked in on me to see how I was doing. And that meant a lot, because I think as managers, we get so focused on making sure that our teams have what we need, that to have somebody reciprocate that was lovely and really meant a lot. And the other thing I would add is, no matter where you are in your organization, no matter what level you're on, don't be afraid to speak up. If you don't have a manager that is checking in with you, or a manager's manager who's checking in with you, don't be afraid to be vocal. I'm struck by a conversation I had last week with a colleague, and the quote that she used when we were talking about sort of feeling overwhelmed was that I can't hear you screaming if you're already underwater, right? So if you need something, we need you, you know, you owe it to your manager, to your organization to say something, to say, I need help, I need a break, I'm overwhelmed, I have too much on my plate, I don't have the right resources, I need technology support, whatever it is. But don't wait too long, because if you let it fester for too long, it's too late. So I think just making sure that you're comfortable being vocal.
I think that's great feedback. Thank you, Angela. We, at this time, I think are going to go ahead and open it up to our attendees to ask any questions that they may have for our panelists. So again, you can drop that in the chat, or if you would like to turn your mic on and ask the question, you are more than welcome. And if you have a question specific to one of our panelists, let us know so that we can get that answer specifically from them. I know we didn't answer all of your questions. How do you balance boundaries and being too available?
I think that's a great question. I know in our organization, we have kind of a 24-hour reply rule, right? So like you can expect a reply to an email within 24 hours, but don't assume that it should be in the next 5 minutes. And I think that's respectful and also full of grace.
Yeah, when I first started here, I mentioned one thing to my team, and I remember saying it again early on in this pandemic, which was, you know, you might get an email from me at 2 in the morning or 10 o'clock at night or whatever that is. It's few and far between that happens, but sometimes it does. And I need you all to understand that I'm doing that because that's when it works for me and for my schedule. That is not the same expectation. If I email you at 5 in the morning, I do not expect an answer from you at 5:15. That's just when it's convenient for me. So I've done a lot more, you know, if I work on a weekend or evening hours or something, I've tried to do a better job of the future sends. I can't think of what it's called, but you know, you draft the email and you get it ready to go, and then you schedule it for 8 a.m. the next morning or whatever that is, because I don't want to make anyone feel like they have to jump, you know, the second that I send something out. So I think that helps with those boundaries as well. And I think reserving time on your calendar, blocking time for yourself. I mean, we've talked about it a lot. We all have Zoom fatigue. We're all on these calls all the time. the advantage with them is that you can go back to back to back because, you know, you don't have to walk from the second floor of the building to the fourth floor of another building for a meeting or whatever the case may be. But still holding that time, you know, if you can end a meeting 5 or 10 minutes early to allow people a break to refill coffee or get a snack or whatever they need to do before getting on the next one. But also not being afraid to hold time on your calendar for work time and block it so that you can actually get work done. Because as much as we all love meetings, there's actual work that needs to happen that doesn't happen in meetings. So you need to have that as well.
So if we get another question here. So as a manager, how do you ensure your team members are still taking the time away that they need to, even if that means them taking a staycation during this pandemic? I think that's a great question. Thanks, Meredith.
Yeah, I'll address that. That you trust them, right? You trust them to tell you the truth. And if you don't have that trust, then you got an uphill climb to begin with. And that seems to have worked for me, right? Ashley and I have a great relationship. If she will let me know if she needs time off, and we'll make it happen. That's not always the norm, right? So when that is not the norm, that's where this concept of reading each other's minds is helpful if you are unwilling to actually ask the question, right? And so as an effective manager, part of my job is to kind of get a sense, get a vibe from those who are my direct reports that something like that is needed.
Yeah, I would add on to that a couple of things. I think it's also sensing it. Sometimes you have to force it. Sometimes it's just a candid conversation to say, listen, you need to step away. You are, you know, super stressed out. I can see it. The tension is, you know, I can feel it through the Zoom screen, right? And so to be able to say, like, I need you to take the afternoon or take a day or whatever it is. I think also modeling that behavior. There's plenty of times, especially early on, where I told my team, I'm like, I'm going to the lake that's by my house. I'm going to go sit outside and compose emails or whatever it is I'm going to do. I'm not going to have internet for the next 2 hours. And that's what I need to do for me. So modeling that behavior, I think, is also one of the things that I would advocate for.
Thank you.
Let me add one more thing. This is a dirty little secret, right? And maybe it's not a little secret. Like Ashley, I have some side hustles, right? I write a column for the Manhattan Mercury. I have some consulting gigs with some other systems. And so my time becomes in demand. And so I will schedule tasks on my calendar, right? So that helps me remember. And so when someone wants to get a hold of me, they'll see my days are full and they might think twice about asking me, or it might force them to make a call. Hey, can we chat about XYZ, right? So that's one way I help manage my time so that the time is reserved for the important stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that relates kind of back to that balancing boundaries and being too available. You know, we talked about how we can be so back to back on Zoom calls, that can contribute to not having that actual work time. And I think blocking out, you know, time on calendars for that work time can kind of contribute to that balancing boundaries and being able to get your stuff done too. Good. Any other questions?
Brooke, I would like to add, just from an employee perspective, like the conversations that I would tell others to have with either their colleagues or their managers is to set the expectations from the get-go, and kind of set the rules of the relationship, right? Like if you're working remote, just to be very clear about what's expected and when you're going to communicate and kind of what the goals are there. I think that's really helpful for me. And sometimes that takes a compromise, right? Like you also have to know your manager. And if your manager is more like loves the details of what you're working on, if you're like a autonomous creative like me and you don't want / need that communication all the time, you may have to compromise and be like, hey, you know, I'm going to touch base with my manager 3 times this week instead of our just one call, just to make sure that they feel good about the work that I'm doing. And that's the political piece of managing relationships as well. Like compromise where you need to in order to develop trust and ensure that you're being perceived well and your work is being done well.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, I would like to thank our panelists for their time. I really appreciate you guys being here. We also appreciate everyone in attendance today. I know we had some new individuals join us for the first time. So I am actually going to pass this over to Amber. She is our HYPE Chamber of Commerce liaison to highlight a few upcoming events that HYPE has going on. So Amber, the mic is yours.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to each of our attendees and our panelists, as Brooke had mentioned. Would like to update you on a few upcoming HYPE events. On April 22nd, we will have a nonprofit happy hour at Colbert Hills. That will be a partnership between young trustees of the Greater Manhattan Community Foundation and with our Love MHK pillar here at HYPE. We will also have Hooray Thursday at Houlihan's on April 29th. On May 5th, we will have our group lunch. This will be on Wednesday for Cinco de Mayo, rather. On May 27th, we have Hooray Thursday with our Wamigo YPs at Willie's Hideout in St. George. So be sure to keep those on the calendar. In addition, we will have be hosting a personal development session with local gardening experts. So those are all really great events as well. We will have a speed lunch networking event soon, and we will also have a family-friendly fun day with food and games at a local park. So be sure to keep those all on your radar, and you can also visit our website and our social media accounts to stay updated on those.
Thanks, Amber. Thank you everyone for attending. And again, thanks to our panelists. Hopefully we will see you at one of our upcoming HYPE events.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks everybody.